Long before cities rose or kingdoms claimed the earth, before history even had a name, there was an age when survival was the only story worth telling. The world was cold, then merciless, vast and beautiful in its cruelty. Across frozen plains and roaring winds, small bands of humans fought for warmth, for fire, and for tomorrow. They left behind no empires, no written words, only traces, bones in the earth, handprints on cave walls, whispers in our blood. For millennia, their names were forgotten, but their endurance shaped everything we are. Before we go deeper into that world, take a moment, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because stories like this, stories of our beginnings, deserve to live again. And tell me, where are you listening from right now? Let's see how far their memory still reaches. Now close your eyes for a second. Imagine the world without cities, without noise, without warmth. The only light comes from fire. The only safety comes from those beside you. This is where our story begins, at the end of the Ice Age, when the earth was still frozen, and the forgotten humans, who would one day become us, took their first breath of survival. The last winter was not a season. It was an era. The sun no longer rose with warmth or promise. It hung in the sky like a dying ember, too weak to chase the shadows that ruled the land. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath. Across the northern world, mountains of ice groaned under their own weight, pressing slowly southward, devouring valleys, forests, and rivers. The air burned with cold so deep it turned every breath into crystal, and the wind carried the mournful echo of things that had ceased to be. Mammoths trudged across the tundra in silent herds, their great tusks rimed with frost. Wolves padded beside them, thin and watchful, their eyes glinting with hunger. The sky was a dim mirror of the frozen ground, the clouds heavy and gray, refusing to break. Even the sea had forgotten how to move. It sat still beneath its armor of ice, a vast white desert stretching to the horizon. In this world, a few humans endured tiny sparks of life scattered across the endless cold. They gathered near caves, near cliffs that caught what little sunlight remained. Their fires were small and precious, flickering beacons against the howling dark. Each flame meant survival. Each ember was a victory stolen from extinction. They wrapped themselves in the hides of mammoths and bison, the fur stiff with frost, their breath clouding the air like ghosts. Nights were endless. Children fell asleep to the sound of the wind clawing at the cave walls, to the low hum of their elders whispering old stories, stories of when the world was green, when rivers ran free, and fruit hung heavy on the trees. They told these tales not to remember, but to resist forgetting. In a world swallowed by ice, memory became the last form of rebellion. Sometimes, the horizon glowed faintly, auroras, dancing in colors no one had names for, ribbons of light weaving across the sky. The people watched them in silence, believing the spirits of their ancestors lived in those shifting veils. It was easier to think the dead had found a place of beauty in the cold than to believe they had vanished entirely. The ice pressed closer each year, swallowing everything it touched. Forests disappeared. Rivers froze in mid-course. But still, humanity endured. They hunted. They sang. They waited for a sun that might never return. The last winter had begun, and no one yet knew it would last for thousands of years. Night has fallen across the white world. The wind screams through the broken teeth of the cliffs, scattering snow into the air like powdered glass. But deep inside a hollow of stone, where the air is thick with smoke and the smell of burned bone, a handful of people huddle close to a trembling fire. The light dances on their faces, painting them in shades of gold and shadow. Around them, the darkness feels endless, pressing in from every direction. Yet here, in this fragile circle of warmth, life still holds its ground. Their hands are rough and scarred, shaped by survival. Simple tools lie beside them, stones sharpened to blades, spears tipped with bone, threads of sinew drying near the fire. These are not the weapons of warriors, but of caretakers, of people who refuse to surrender to the hunger that prowls just beyond the light. Outside, the wolves watch, their eyes like small embers glowing in the dark. Inside, the humans whisper stories. No one knows who first began to speak. Perhaps it was the eldest woman, her hair white as frost, her voice low and rhythmic. She tells of the great hunt, when the world was still young and the sky was warmer. Her words are heavy with memory, though no one alive was there to see what she describes. Around her, the others listen not because they believe every detail, but because belief itself is the last comfort left to them. The children lean closer, eyes wide, watching the fire as if the flames themselves are telling the tale. The man nearest the entrance feeds another branch into the fire, watching sparks drift upward into the cave ceiling like tiny souls seeking the stars. He knows that without this flame, the cold will claim them before dawn. The fire is not just heat, it is faith made visible, a reminder that light can exist even when the sun will not rise. Every flicker, every crackle, is a promise that they will last one more night. They eat in silence, gnawing on dried meat, each bite slow and deliberate. Beyond the firelight, the world groans with the shifting of glaciers. But here there is a rhythm, the soft murmur of stories, the hiss of the fire, the steady heartbeat of human persistence. When sleep finally takes them, one by one, the fire still burns. Its glow spills across the stone walls, illuminating handprints left by those who came before, a silent reminder that others once sat here too, whispering their own vows to survive the dark. Long before we called ourselves the only kind of human, the world was shared. Across the frozen plains and shadowed forests of the Ice Age, more than one kind of thinking creature walked the earth. They built fires, shaped tools, and dreamed under the same indifferent stars. But time, cruel and silent, began to erase their names. What remains now are fragments, bones buried in darkness, tools chipped from forgotten hands, whispers of people who once stood beside us and vanished without farewell. They were smaller, sturdier, built for endurance more than speed. Their skulls were thick, their brows heavy, their voices perhaps deeper. The Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and others whose names we will never know. For hundreds of thousands of years they thrived in the cold, where even animals hesitated to live. They hunted mammoth and bison, crafted necklaces from the teeth of wolves, painted their dead with red ochre to guide them into whatever lay beyond. These were not beasts, they were kin. When the ice was at its fiercest, when every breath turned to pain, and every sunrise promised another day of hunger, it was they who endured. Their shelters were carved into the rock, their fires burned low to hide from the wind. They learned to listen to the earth, to the sky, to the rhythm of survival. While many species faltered, they adapted, living not against nature but within it. Somewhere, far from their caves, our ancestors wandered north, Homo sapiens, leaner, curious, carrying strange tongues and new tools. The first meetings were not battles. They were moments of recognition, one human seeing another across the firelight and realizing they were not alone. They traded, they shared, and sometimes they loved. Their children carried the blood of both worlds, proof that difference was never as deep as we once imagined. But as the millennia passed, the ice began to recede, and so too did the others. Their camps emptied. Their tools lay untouched. Their songs went silent. Whether by hunger, by disease, or by the slow tide of our own expansion, they disappeared, leaving only echoes in our DNA, a faint signature, a reminder that we are not as singular as we think. Somewhere in every one of us, there lingers a spark of the forgotten kind. It stirs in the way we fear the dark yet are drawn to fire. It hums in our bones when we hear the wind move through empty places. They are gone, yes, but not lost. Their blood still moves within us, unseen but alive, carrying the memory of the first humans who learned what it truly meant to survive. The story of who we are does not begin with us. It begins in the cold, in the bloodlines that crossed beneath the same gray skies, when survival was measured in breaths and firelight. Thousands of years ago, in the shadows of glaciers and the silence of caves, different kinds of humans met. They did not know they were writing history. They were simply trying to live. When our ancestors wandered out of Africa into the frozen north, They found the Neanderthals already there, broad-shouldered, pale-skinned, eyes adjusted to the dim light of endless winters. They were not monsters or myths. They were people, masters of the hunt, builders of stone shelters, caretakers of their dead. Their fires burned long before ours arrived, and when we did, the meeting was not a clash of worlds, but a merging of them. Perhaps it began with a shared kill. A carcass of reindeer left in the snow. A wary glance that softened to curiosity. Hands reaching out to offer warmth. The language of survival does not need words. Somewhere in that frozen silence, two lines of humanity intertwined. From that union came children whose blood carried the strength of both worlds, new faces born beneath a dying Sunday. Science has found their ghosts hidden within us. A fragment of a jawbone. A single tooth. A twist of code inside our DNA. When researchers mapped the human genome, they discovered traces of Neanderthals and Denisovans living quietly within our cells. Between 1 and 4% of our genetic makeup still carries their signature. Every heartbeat, every breath, every dream we have ever had hums with the memory of ancient encounters. Some of these gifts remain visible. Stronger immune systems forged from the diseases they survived. Adaptations that let our ancestors breathe thinner, mountain air, endure colder nights. Even our skin, our hair, our sleep carry whispers of those forgotten unions. In the snowbound world of the Ice Age, survival was not pure. It was shared. And perhaps, somewhere, there was another. A lineage we have not yet named. A human lost to time. Their blood woven into ours so deeply that only fragments remain. They were here once, and through us, they still are. When the wind howls through the dark and the stars glimmer on white fields of snow, we carry them forward without knowing it. The forgotten bloodlines that refuse to vanish, the quiet proof that humanity has never been one thing, but many, surviving together beneath the same endless sky. Deep within the frozen mountains of Siberia, there lies a cave where time itself seems to hold its breath. The wind outside howls through the pines, sweeping over drifts of snow that have buried entire centuries. Inside, the air is still and cold, the walls dark with age. It was here, in a place called Denisova, that a discovery was made so small it could fit in the palm of a hand, yet so vast it rewrote what it meant to be human. It began with a fragment, a sliver of bone no bigger than a pebble. It was the last joint of a finger, belonging to a young girl who lived more than 40,000 years ago. Beside it, a tiny molar tooth, smooth from a mouth that would never smile again. To the naked eye, they were nothing remarkable. But when scientists touched them with the tools of modern curiosity, the world hidden inside them began to speak. From these quiet relics, an entire people rose out of extinction and into memory. The girl's DNA told a story no one expected. She was not Neanderthal, not modern human, but something else, something in between. A sister lineage, long forgotten. Her people had lived in these mountains, hunted in the valleys, breathed the thin air of the high plateaus. They were strong, clever, and quietly resilient. They crafted tools from bone and stone, survived in places colder than nightmares. And when they met others, Neanderthal or human, they left behind more than footprints. They left their blood. She is now known to us only as the Denisovan girl, though her real name was never spoken by human lips. Through her, we discovered a lost branch of the human tree, one that still lives within us. A small percentage of her genetic code flows through the people of Southeast Asia, Oceania, and parts of Tibet. The ability of some to breathe easily atop the world's highest mountains traces back to her kind. The child who died in that Siberian cave gave the living a gift of endurance that would last forever. When you imagine her, do not think of her as ancient or distant. Picture her instead by the light of her fire, the shadows of the cave flickering across her face. Snow gathers at the entrance while she listens to the wind, not knowing her bones will outlast her language, her people, and even her world. She could not know that 40 millennia later, her finger bone would awaken her story again, that the frozen silence of her cave would one day echo with her return. Winter had become more than a season. It was a ruler, merciless and eternal. The snow no longer melted, even in the months once called summer, and the world was trapped in a long, slow hunger. The people who lived through it no longer counted days, for days had lost their meaning. They counted fires, they counted breaths, they counted the empty spaces where food should have been. The mammoths, once countless as clouds on the plains, now moved farther and farther away. Their herds thinned. Their bones littered the ice like monuments to exhaustion. Even the rivers, once alive with fish, had turned to glass. Beneath that glass, silence reigned. In this world of scarcity, survival became an art. Every act of endurance was an invention. The people learned to scrape the marrow from bones long after the meat was gone. They learned to boil hides to make broth thick enough to trick the stomach into believing it was full. Hunger taught them to listen to the wind for the call of distant herds, to the snow for the soft crunch that meant something still moved out there, something worth chasing. At night, when the fires burned low and every spark was precious, stories replaced food. The elders spoke softly, their voices cracked and weary, weaving tales of warmer times. They told the children about lands where trees grew thick and heavy with fruit, where water ran fast and clear, where the sun lingered longer in the sky. The children listened with wide eyes, their bellies empty but their imaginations full. In a world where little could grow, hope was the last surviving crop. The cold pressed deeper each year. Frost crept into the bones of the earth itself. But the people did not surrender. They shaped new tools from flint and ivory, learned to stitch tighter furs, built shelters that hugged the ground to steal the warmth of the soil. They began to think differently, to plan beyond tomorrow. Hunger became their teacher, and from its lessons came the beginnings of invention. In that frozen world, every mouthful was a miracle. Every sunrise was a victory. The people who lived on the edge of hunger were not merely surviving, they were evolving. The cold was sculpting them, sharpening their minds and hardening their will. Long after the last of the mammoths vanished, something else would remain: the quiet intelligence of those who had learned to outthink winter itself. Deep beneath the skin of the frozen world, where the wind cannot reach and the snow cannot bury, there are places where fire once flickered and human hands reached out toward eternity. Inside those narrow caves, where darkness breathes like a living thing, the first artists of the Ice Age found their canvas. They carried torches made of resin and bone, their light trembling against the damp stone walls. The air smelled of smoke, ash, and earth. Here, beneath tons of sleeping rock, they began to paint. They mixed pigment from crushed ochre, charcoal, and minerals pulled from the earth's bones. Red like blood, black like night, yellow like the faint promise of Sunday. With animal fat they made it cling to the wall, and with the hollow bones of birds they blew color into the shapes they desired. Fingers pressed against stone, tracing the outline of life itself. Bison, horses, mammoths, lions, and hands, always the hands. Thousands of them, stenciled in red or black, palms pressed against the rock as if to say, "We were here. We existed. Remember us." These were not decorations. They were not made for beauty or pride. They were prayers carved in pigment, offerings to the unknown. In a world ruled by cold and hunger, art was not luxury, it was survival of the spirit. Each line carried a meaning only they could understand. Each animal drawn upon the wall may have been a memory, a warning, or a request for mercy from forces they could not name. The walls became their language when words were not enough. Imagine them there, crouched in the flickering glow of firelight. Their shadows stretch across the painted beasts, making them move, come alive. The walls seem to breathe. The hunters chant softly, the echoes bouncing off the stone until it feels as though the earth itself hums along. For a moment, they are no longer afraid of the dark or the hunger waiting outside. In this chamber of light and color, they have built something immortal. When morning comes, the fire burns out. Smoke rises into cracks in the ceiling, carrying their prayers upward. They step out into the cold again, into the blinding white of the Ice Age, leaving behind the warmth of their creation. They do not look back. They know the cave will keep their memory long after they are gone. Thousands of years later, we find them. We walk into those same caves, Lascaux, Altamira, Chauvet, and the walls still whisper. The paint has not faded, the hands still reach from the darkness. It feels as though someone has just stepped away, as though the fire might still be warm if we touch it. In those moments, time folds in on itself. The people who lived 40,000 years ago breathe beside us again. Their art is their voice, and through it, they speak across millennia. They tell us that even in the bleakest age, when the world was frozen and death was constant, humanity still found the will to create, to remember, to hope. The breath of stone still lingers, carrying the oldest truth of all, that even surrounded by darkness, humans have always reached for light. The world was white and endless, a frozen sea of silence stretching beyond sight. The wind sang across the tundra, cold enough to flay the skin, sharp enough to carve valleys out of stone. In that vast emptiness, small figures moved against the horizon, humans, wrapped in the hides of beasts they had slain. Their fur cloaks were stiff with frost, their hands blistered and cracked from the cold. Every breath they took turned to mist, rising like smoke from a dying fire. They were the hunters of the White Plain, wanderers in a world that no longer wanted them. The hunt began before sunrise. The air trembled with the sound of distant hooves, muffled beneath the snow. Somewhere ahead, a herd of mammoth moved slowly across the plain, their massive bodies dark against the pale earth. The people watched from a ridge, their faces painted with ash and determination. This hunt was not sport, it was survival. Each spear they carried meant life or death for the group that waited miles behind, children, elders, and the weak, all counting on what these few could bring home. The leader, a man with hair turned white long before his age, knelt and pressed his ear to the ground. He could feel the rhythm of the herd through the frozen soil, the heartbeat of giants. He whispered a prayer, not to a God of mercy, but to one of balance. In this world, life was taken only to give life. The others lowered their heads in silence, then began their slow descent onto the plain. They moved as one, careful and deliberate, melting into the landscape like ghosts. The snow crunched softly beneath their feet, each step measured against the wind. When they drew close enough, the scent of the animals reached them: musk, sweat, and ancient earth. The mammoths were grazing, unaware that eyes watched them from the edge of the ridge. The hunters crouched low, their breath shallow, their spears tipped with sharpened bone hardened in fire. At the signal, they broke from the snow like an eruption, the air filled with shouts and the thunder of hooves. Spears flew, slicing through the wind, finding their mark in flesh. The earth shook as one of the giants stumbled, trumpeting in pain. The others scattered, the herd dividing in panic. The hunters pressed forward, driving their prey into a pit they had carved from the frozen ground. It ended quickly, as all things must. Silence followed, heavy and sacred. The people gathered around the fallen beast. No one cheered, no one smiled. They placed their hands upon its thick hide, whispering thanks, acknowledging the trade between life and death. Then the work began. Blades of stone tore through flesh. Steam rose from the carcass, mingling with the cold breath of the living. They would take everything: the meat, the bones, the sinew, even the tusks. Nothing would be wasted. Nothing could be. By nightfall, the hunters returned to their camp. Smoke curled into the sky from distant fires, carrying the scent of roasting meat and survival. Children ran to meet them, eyes wide with relief. The elders lifted their faces to the stars, murmuring old words that had guided them for generations. Above them, the sky shimmered with auroras, waves of color dancing like spirits over the white plain. In that moment, under a frozen heaven, they were not just hunters. They were the heartbeat of a fragile world, keeping the fire of humanity alive in the vast and merciless cold. The world was no longer one thing. It had split into opposites: ice in the west, fire in the east, frost and flame carving two faces of the same earth. Across the frozen steppes of Europe, the air stung like broken glass, and glaciers groaned as they crawled across the land. But far away, in the volcanic valleys of Asia, the ground itself burned. Smoke rose from mountains that breathed fire, their slopes blackened by rivers of molten stone. Between these two extremes, humanity found its testing ground. The people of the cold learned silence and patience. They followed the herds through the endless white, their lives measured in steps across the tundra. They wrapped themselves in layers of fur and fat, carried fire inside hollowed bones, and built their shelters half buried in snow to trap the heat of their breath. They were sculpted by the frost, strong, enduring, shaped by scarcity and struggle. Far to the east, others lived in the breath of volcanoes. The air there shimmered with heat and ash, and the earth smelled of sulfur and life reborn. These people learned to live with the trembling ground, to use the warmth of the earth as an ally. Their fires burned hotter, their food richer. They carved tools from obsidian sharp as lightning, their eyes reflecting the glow of the lava that flowed through their valleys. To survive in fire was to move fast, to rebuild what the earth destroyed again and again. For a time, these two worlds did not meet. But as the ice sheets began to retreat and the land bridges reappeared, paths opened between them. Hunters followed herds across the plains, traders carried shells, pigments, and stories. The cold people met the fire people, and something extraordinary happened. They did not war. They merged. It began with simple exchanges, stone for fur, bone for obsidian. Then, curiosity grew bolder. They shared food, songs, and fire. Some shared more. A child born of both worlds carried traits unseen before, the endurance of ice and the vitality of flame. Bloodlines that had once been isolated began to braid together. New tongues formed, new rituals, new faces. Humanity was becoming a single thread, woven from many colors of survival. In the caves of Altai, the genes of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens intertwined, leaving traces that still echo in us today. From those unions came adaptations that allowed some to breathe in thin mountain air, to endure intense cold, to survive drought and disease. What we call diversity now began as a necessity, then a promise between people who refused extinction. When night fell, the travelers gathered around shared fires. They spoke of the places they had come from, of the spirits of ice and the gods of flame, of mountains that bled and rivers that froze. Above them, the aurora shimmered green and gold, meeting the glow of distant volcanoes on the horizon. The earth itself seemed to mirror them, opposites touching, fire meeting frost. From that union, something new was born. Humanity was no longer scattered tribes bound by region or climate. It was a single species stitched together by struggle, love, and chance. The children of ice and fire carried within them the resilience of both worlds, a balance that would define the future. And as the glaciers melted and the ground cooled, the first whispers of civilization stirred. The world was changing, and humanity was learning to change with it. There was no ceremony, no conquest, no moment that marked the beginning. It happened quietly, in the hush of the Ice Age world, when two kinds of humans met beneath the same cold sky. The Neanderthals and the modern humans were not enemies. They were kin divided by time, reflections of one another separated only by the long march of evolution. When they met, they did not see monsters or strangers, they saw familiarity. The shape of a hand, the gaze of an eye, the warmth of a fire shared between them. The first meeting might have been cautious, a chance encounter on a hunt, a figure spotted through the mist, both tense but curious. They circled one another like animals, unsure whether to flee or approach. A gesture was made, a gift, perhaps a piece of meat, a stone blade, a sign of peace. In that small exchange, something ancient stirred. Curiosity overcame fear. Firelight replaced distance. They began to learn from one another. Neanderthals, sturdy and clever, showed how to shape flint with precision, how to survive in deep cold. The newcomers, thinner but more adaptable, carried strange tools, beads, and songs that told of faraway lands. Their voices mingled, their laughter echoed in the same caves. Language may have been different, but the meaning was universal. The need to belong, to connect, to be seen. Over time, these encounters became more than meetings. They became unions. A man of the plains finding warmth beside a woman of the mountains. A Neanderthal child tracing her fingers over a shell necklace from another world. Around shared fires, two kinds of humanity learned the same rhythm of heartbeats. Love, in its most primal form, became the bridge between species. Their children were living proof of that union, faces unlike either parent, carrying the strength of one and the imagination of the other. In them, the lines between us and them dissolved. They inherited blood that remembered ice and wind, stone and story. They were the first true hybrids of humanity, carrying forward the legacy of both worlds. For a time they thrived together. They hunted, sang, and buried their dead side by side. The earth itself seemed to acknowledge their bond, but the ice would not wait, and neither would fate. As climates shifted and migrations continued, the Neanderthals dwindled, their voices fading like echoes in a cavern. Yet they did not vanish entirely. They lived on in the blood of those they had joined. Every heartbeat that followed carried a fragment of their endurance, their artistry, their fire. Thousands of years later, scientists would uncover the truth written in our DNA, that between 1 and 4% of every human outside Africa carries the mark of that ancient marriage. A whisper of Neanderthal within us, invisible but undeniable. The invisible marriage was not about conquest or dominance. It was about survival through unity, the merging of difference into strength. When we look into the mirror, we do not see the face of one kind of human. We see the memory of two blended by time, bound by love, and carried forward through every breath we take. The story of humanity is not pure. It was never meant to be. It was written by the joining of worlds that refused to remain apart. The cold returned like a memory that refused to fade. The skies dimmed, the winds hardened, and the earth began to draw its frozen breath once more. Across continents, the glaciers stirred, inching forward like living beasts of ice. They devoured everything in their path: forests, valleys, rivers, and plains. What had once been fertile hunting ground became a graveyard of frost. The sound of cracking ice echoed through the mountains, louder than thunder, as if the world itself were breaking apart. The people who had once wandered freely across the open lands now watched the horizon close in. The trails their ancestors had walked for generations vanished beneath snow. Rivers that once carried fish and fresh water froze solid, transforming into gleaming walls that stretched to the sky. Those who lingered too long were swallowed whole. So they moved slowly, painfully, always south, always toward the promise of warmth. Families packed what little they owned: stone tools, furs, a few sacred relics, and the memory of places they would never see again. The old ones wept quietly, their eyes lingering on mountains they knew they would not survive to cross. The younger ones led the way, their footprints marking a new path through the drifts. Each step south was both a retreat and an act of defiance. They traveled in silence, guided by the stars and the instincts that had carried humanity through every storm before. Nights were cruel. The fires burned low, the wood scarce. Children slept wrapped in hides, pressed against their mothers for warmth. The air was so cold it peeled the skin from their lips, froze their tears before they could fall. And still, they moved forward, because to stop was to die. As the herds of mammoth, bison, and reindeer migrated south, the hunters followed. But each year the animals grew fewer, the land narrower, the competition fiercer. Other groups appeared on the horizon, faces unfamiliar, eyes filled with the same hunger. At first, they shared. Then they fought. Survival was no longer about hunting, it was about claiming the last scraps of the world that remained unfrozen. In the wake of the glaciers, the earth changed forever. Old forests crumbled beneath their weight, Rivers carved new courses, and coastlines retreated as ice locked the seas. The world the first humans had known was gone, and a new one, harsher and smaller, took its place. Those who survived learned to adapt faster than ever before. They built sturdier shelters, found warmth in the earth itself, and learned to store food against the long winters that now stretched for years. But the Great Retreat was not only a journey of survival, it was the moment humanity learned humility before nature. The people realized they could not shape the world to their will, they could only endure what it gave them. And yet, that endurance became their greatest strength. For every life the ice claimed, 100 more pressed on, carrying fire and faith through the dark. When spring finally came, it was weak and uncertain. The snow melted only in patches, revealing bones and broken tools half buried beneath the frost. But where there had once been despair, there was now resolve. The people who had fled the glaciers were changed. They had seen the world remade and lived to tell the tale. They were no longer wanderers. They were survivors of a dying age, witnesses to the Earth's transformation. And as they looked back one last time at the mountains of ice that had chased them south, they knew the truth. Humanity's strength was not in conquest, but in persistence. The wind never stopped singing across the white plains, but that night, its voice was joined by another. A thin, haunting sound drifted through the air, rising and falling like the cry of something ancient. It came from a small fire burning in the mouth of a cave, where a lone woman sat hunched over a handful of hollow bird bones. Her fingers, cracked from cold, moved with the patience of someone who had carved 100 before. Each stroke of her flint blade shaved the bone smooth. Each breath of her mouth tested its song. She was the last musician of her people, and her audience was the endless night. They called her the Singer of Bones. No one remembered her real name. Some said she had once been a mother, others that she had wandered away from her tribe after the last of her kin had perished in the snow. Whatever her story, she had not spoken in years. Words had grown useless in a world this quiet. Only the music remained. When she lifted the flute to her lips, the sound that came was unlike anything the cold world had ever known. It was not melody, it was memory. Each note carried the breath of the dead, the echo of those who had once walked these frozen valleys. The sound wove through the wind, curling around the bones of fallen animals, seeping into the cracks of the ice. It was a voice for all who had none. The tribes that wandered nearby sometimes heard her music from afar. They would stop, standing motionless in the snow, unsure whether it was human or spirit. To some, it was a warning. To others, a blessing. Hunters swore that her song brought calm to the mammoths, that the beasts paused mid-stride, listening, as if they too remembered something lost. Parents told their children that the sound came from the earth itself, singing for those who had survived its cruelty. But the truth was simpler. She played to keep her own heart beating. The music filled the silence that would have swallowed her otherwise. Each night she played until her fingers went numb, until the stars blurred through her tears. The flute was her prayer, her way of speaking to the ones she had buried in snow long ago. Sometimes, she imagined they answered the whisper of wind through the cracks, the creak of the ice shifting above, the faint shimmer of light that flickered against the cave walls. When dawn came, she set her flute aside and watched the sky pale from black to gray. She had carved a dozen flutes in her life, each from a different bird, each with its own voice. She never kept them for long. When the time felt right, she placed them upright in the snow and let the wind claim them. The sound they made as the air passed through was thin but eternal, a soft chorus carried across the frozen plains. One morning, the Singer of Bones did not rise. Her fire burned low, her tools lay beside her, and her final flute rested in her hand. When the wind swept through the cave, it played one last note, long and trembling, before fading into silence. But her song did not die. It traveled with the snow, with the breath of those who came after. It slipped into the memory of humankind, reminding us that even in a world of ice and extinction, someone once made music not to be heard, but to be remembered. The air inside the cave was thick with smoke and breath. Firelight shivered against the damp stone walls, making the painted animals come alive in flickers of gold and shadow. The shapes of mammoths, horses, and bison seemed to move in rhythm with the flames, as if summoned back from the dead for one more dance. Deep beneath the frozen limestone, a gathering had begun, a ritual both ancient and necessary, born from hunger and faith. They came from the cold world above, stepping one by one into the sacred dark. The hunters, the mothers, the elders, and the children. Each carried something: a torch, a fragment of bone, a piece of dried meat, or a handful of red ochre. None spoke as they entered. The silence was deliberate, heavy with meaning. Here, beneath the earth, words could not reach what needed to be spoken. Only the heart could. At the center of the chamber, the fire burned low and steady. Around it, the tribe formed a circle. The oldest among them, his hair white as ash, knelt beside the flames and drew a line of ochre across his forehead, then another across his chest. His voice rose, a slow chant in a tongue so old that even he no longer knew its first meaning. It was not a prayer to gods, but to memory, to the beasts that had fed them, the ancestors who had guided them, and the earth that had both sheltered and starved them. The others joined in, their voices merging into one sound that filled the cave. It echoed through the tunnels, rising and falling like the beat of a heart. Shadows danced across the walls, and for a moment, it was as if the paintings themselves were singing back. The tribe believed that the spirits of the hunted animals lived inside those painted forms, waiting to be released through fire and sound. To honor them was to ensure another hunt, another chance to live. When the chant ended, the women laid out the feast, small offerings of meat, roots, and broth, placed carefully beside the fire. No one ate yet. The food was first for those who could no longer join them. A mother whispered her child's name into the flames. A man closed his eyes and placed his palm against the stone, feeling the pulse of the world beneath. The air was alive with warmth, with sorrow, with gratitude. Then, slowly, they began to eat. Each bite was taken in silence, each swallow a vow to endure another season. The children watched the fire and the painted beasts above it, their eyes wide and unblinking. They would remember this night when they were grown, and they would lead the next feast when the time came. The ritual was not about belief, it was about belonging, about holding the fragile thread of humanity together when the cold threatened to cut it apart. When the fire burned down to embers, the tribe stood. One by one, they pressed their painted hands to the wall beside the ancient animals, leaving red silhouettes that would outlive them all. It was their signature, their proof of existence, their way of saying, "We survived this night." When they left the cave, the wind howled outside, carrying the scent of snow and smoke. The Feast of Shadows was over, but its echo lingered underground, locked in stone and silence. Thousands of years later, those handprints would still remain, glowing faintly under torchlight. Not as a relic of superstition, but as a testament, a record of a people who faced the darkness and chose to answer it with fire. The world fell silent, not for days or years, but for centuries. Snow buried the plains where forests once swayed, and the mountains wore crowns of ice so thick that even sunlight could not pierce them. The wind no longer sang, it moaned, slow and hollow, like the breath of a dying giant. For countless generations, the earth slept beneath its frozen shroud, and the ones who lived upon it learned to whisper, to move softly, as if afraid to wake it. The people who endured this long sleep of the world did not think of seasons anymore. Summer was a memory carried only in stories, told by trembling voices beside fading fires. Children were born into the cold and died without ever knowing the warmth of rain. Villages were not built, they were carved, hollowed into cliffs or burrowed beneath snow, insulated by bones and furs. Smoke curled weakly from their fires, rising into a sky that never cleared. The ice was everywhere. It crept down from the mountains, swallowing valleys, pushing rivers aside, grinding stone into dust. Beneath it, the world changed in secret. The glaciers became the memory of the earth, trapping air, pollen, ash, and bone in their frozen hearts. Each layer of snow was a page written in time, a record of breath and blood preserved for millennia. The past did not vanish here, it waited. Animals that had once ruled the plains vanished one by one. The mammoths fell first, their massive shapes disappearing into the white. The great cave bears, the saber-toothed cats, the woolly rhinoceroses all succumbed to hunger and cold. Their bones sank beneath the frost and were sealed away, like treasures no one would find for thousands of years. But the people did not vanish. They adapted. In the stillness of this frozen age, they learned patience. They followed the herds that still wandered, moving with them like shadows. They carved shelters from ice, their walls glittering in firelight. They sang softly into the darkness, songs that were half prayer, half lullaby melodies, meant to remind the world that life still breathed. To survive here was not to conquer, but to endure. There were moments when even the strongest faltered. A child lost to the cold, a fire that refused to catch, a sky that seemed endless in its grayness. Yet somehow, they continued. They buried their dead beneath cairns of stone, marking each with a symbol, believing the ice would keep them safe until the sun returned. And in a strange way, it did. The glaciers became their guardians, preserving every trace of their existence, their tools, their bodies, their hopes. Time passed, slow as drifting snow. The earth slept on, unbothered by the struggles above it. Mountains shifted. Oceans froze. The stars themselves seemed to hold their breath. But beneath the layers of ice, something was stirring. The cold could not last forever. The world, though buried, was alive, waiting for a single spark to begin its thaw. When the first crack of melting ice echoed through the valleys, it was not thunder but prophecy. The long sleep of the world was ending. And as water began to flow once more, trickling through the veins of the frozen earth, it carried with it the voices of those who had endured, their whispers rising through the ages, saying, "We were here. We waited. We survived." It began with a sound. Not loud at first, but deep. A low groan that rolled across the horizon, like a voice stirring from 1,000-year sleep. The people who lived beneath the shadow of the glaciers had never heard it before. It came from the mountains, from the rivers buried beneath stone and frost. The air trembled. The ice was crying. For generations, the world had been frozen in silence. The sky hung pale and heavy, the ground locked in stillness. But now, something ancient was breaking. Cracks opened along the glacier's face, echoing like thunder across the plains. Massive slabs of ice, each older than memory, sheared away and crashed into the valleys below, shattering with a sound that carried for miles. The people stopped what they were doing and listened, afraid to move. To them, it was as though the sky itself had split. At first, they thought it was anger, the earth punishing them, the spirits beneath the ice calling for quiet again. But then came the rivers. Tiny threads of water trickling through the cracks, glistening under the gray Sunday. The air softened, the winds grew damp. The first drop of meltwater fell upon the frozen ground, steaming faintly as it touched the earth. And though no one understood it yet, that drop was the beginning of the end of the world they had always known. The thaw spread slowly but relentlessly. Day by day, the great white plains turned to oceans of slush and mud. Valleys that had once been death traps of frost now filled with roaring meltwater. Rivers carved new paths through ancient stone, lakes were born overnight, and the seas rose higher with each season. Where mammoths had roamed, now came flocks of birds returning to lands they had long forgotten. The world was breathing again, and its breath carried both promise and peril. The people followed the retreating ice, step by step, chasing warmth they had never dared to dream of. The frozen ground that once broke their tools now softened underfoot. They found green shoots piercing the wet soil, plants that had not grown there in thousands of years. They tasted them cautiously, their tongues remembering flavors older than memory. The smell of earth replaced the scent of snow, and it was intoxicating. But with the thaw came danger. Floods swallowed the lowlands, swallowing entire camps overnight. The sound of collapsing ice was constant, like the beating of a great drum. the air filled with mist so thick it cloaked the Sunday. The people moved higher, building shelters on ridges that had once been buried. The animals changed too. Some fled north, following the last traces of cold. Others, wolves, bears, and wild horses moved south, adapting to the new world that was being born beneath the melting sky. For the first time in centuries, rain fell instead of snow. It pattered softly at first, then in torrents, washing the dust of ice from the faces of mountains. The rivers swelled until they burst their banks, carving valleys that would one day cradle civilizations. The sound of running water became the new heartbeat of the earth. When night came, the people sat by their fires and watched the ice glow faintly under the moonlight, melting drop by drop. They did not know that this moment would change everything, that the warmth they welcomed would bring both life and loss. As the glaciers retreated, they uncovered lands rich with promise but also fragile, waiting to be shaped by the hands of humankind. The ice was crying, yes, but not in sorrow. Its tears were the sound of transformation, the world shedding its old skin. The long winter had ended, and a new chapter was beginning. The people did not yet call it history, but they could feel it in their bones. The age of ice was dying, and the age of men was about to begin. The thaw that began with a whisper soon became a roar. The ice, once silent and unmoving, now collapsed in great torrents of water that shook the very bones of the earth. Rivers burst from their frozen prisons, raging through canyons carved by centuries of cold. The land trembled beneath the flood. Valleys that had been buried under glaciers were suddenly alive with motion, filled with the unstoppable force of meltwater rushing toward the sea. The world was being rewritten, one flood at a time. The people watched in awe and terror. Their ancestors had told stories of gods and spirits buried in the mountains, but now those gods seemed to have awoken. The rivers swelled so high they swallowed entire plains. Lakes formed where grass once grew. Hills vanished beneath the waves. The land they had known for generations was dissolving before their eyes. Camps were washed away in the night, and the bones of ancient beasts rose from the mud as the water tore through the ground. Far to the north, the land bridges that had once connected continents began to sink. Paths that hunters had followed for centuries disappeared beneath the swelling tides. The world grew smaller as the oceans rose higher. Tribes who had once walked freely between lands were now divided by water, stranded on islands that had never existed before. The boundaries of the earth were changing, and with them, the fate of humankind. But even as the floods devoured the old world, they revealed something new. The ice had hidden rich valleys and fertile plains beneath its weight. As it melted away, the soil emerged dark and alive, glistening with promise. Plants began to grow where nothing had survived before. Herds of animals migrated into the fresh grasslands, followed closely by human footsteps. The people who had once fled from the glaciers now followed the receding water, moving into lands that seemed almost reborn. Migration became the rhythm of survival. Families packed their belongings and walked until their legs gave out, searching for high ground, for shelter, for a place the water could not reach. The air was thick with mist, the smell of salt and earth filling every breath. They built rafts of wood and bone, learning to float across the new rivers that divided their world. Some did not return, but those who did brought stories of new horizons, lands untouched by ice, places where the sun lingered longer and the soil was soft beneath their feet. Every journey carried both hope and loss. They left behind graves swallowed by water, carvings erased from cave walls, memories drowned beneath the tide, yet each dawn brought discovery. They found seas full of fish, cliffs where the wind sang through hollow stone, valleys glowing with the first wildflowers in 1,000 years. For the first time, the earth smelled of life instead of frost. The floods were not kind, but they were not cruel either. They were transformation in motion, nature's way of reminding humanity that nothing stays still forever. The people learned that survival was not about holding on, but about letting go of land, of fear, of the idea that the world would remain the same. When the waters finally calmed, the map of the planet had changed. What had once been one continent was now many. The oceans gleamed wider, deeper, and full of mystery. The people stood on new shores, their footprints the first marks on untouched ground. Behind them lay the drowned bones of the old world, before them, the endless unknown. In that moment, humanity did what it had always done. It adapted. It looked upon the flooded valleys not as endings, but as beginnings. The world had washed itself clean, and those who remained would write the next story in the mud of a new earth. When the floods receded and the fires cooled, silence returned to the valleys, but it was not the same silence that had ruled the Ice Age. It was softer now, filled with the crackle of new life and the distant laughter of children who would never know the weight of glaciers. Yet the people remembered. The ones who had endured the long winters, who had fled the rising seas, carried within them a treasury of memory. They had no books, no carvings on stone, no written words to preserve their stories. But they had voices, and in those voices, the first library of humankind was born. Around every fire, as the stars shimmered in their familiar patterns above the unfamiliar new world, the elders began to speak. Their words flowed like rivers, carrying the weight of generations. They told of the white mountains that once walked across the earth, of rivers that froze in place, of the great beasts that fell silent one by one. They spoke of thunder that came not from the sky but from the breaking of ice, and of floods so vast that they swallowed whole lands. To the children, these tales sounded like dreams, too vast to believe. But to the elders, they were not stories, they were memories. As years passed, those memories grew into myths. The glaciers became sleeping gods, vast and cold, whose breath could freeze the earth. The floods became the wrath of water spirits who demanded respect from humankind. Lightning was the spear of the sky, hurled by unseen forces that ruled the balance between fire and frost. In every myth was a fragment of truth, a reflection of something once seen, once feared, once survived. The storytellers were the guardians of this fragile history. They carried the voices of the past not on parchment, but in rhythm and song. Each generation added their own verse, their own lesson, their own warning. Around every hearth, the words changed shape, growing richer and deeper, but their essence remained. They were not meant to be exact, they were meant to live. The children listened with wide eyes as their elders painted worlds with words. They learned to remember through repetition, to speak with reverence. Each phrase was a thread connecting them to those who had come before, binding the living to the dead. Long before temples or kingdoms, these stories were the only inheritance humanity could pass down. They were maps of meaning, guides through a world that had reshaped itself beyond recognition. Over time, these spoken memories gave rise to the first beliefs. Some tribes worshipped the warmth of the sun, calling it the great fire that once saved their ancestors. Others honored the sea, fearful of its power to both give and take life. Every god, every spirit, every legend traced its roots to something real: a storm, a fire, a flood, a night spent trembling in the cold. What began as memory became faith. What began as warning became wisdom. Through stories, the survivors learned to belong again. They could not reclaim the lands they had lost, but they could keep them alive in words. And so the storytellers became as vital as hunters, as sacred as the fire itself. Without them, history would vanish like smoke. With them, it could endure forever. As the wind carried their voices into the night, the stars listened, the same stars that had watched over their ancestors through the Ice Age. And though the glaciers had melted, their memory lived on, whispered across generations by those who refused to forget. The storytellers, the memory carriers, were the heartbeat of humanity. They were the reason that even when everything else froze, the human spirit never did. High above the clouds, where the air thins and the world feels untouched by time, there are places where whispers of the past still linger. In the highlands of Papua, in the cold caves of Siberia, and along the jagged ridges of the Himalayas, the earth keeps a secret older than memory. For thousands of years, people believed that one kind of human survived the end of the Ice Age. But buried in bone, in blood, in breath itself, science found a different story. a story of a tribe that never truly vanished. It began with a single fragment. Deep inside a Siberian cave, researchers unearthed a tooth the size of a pebble, smooth and ancient, untouched by light for tens of thousands of years. When they tested it, the results shocked the world. Its DNA did not belong to Neanderthals or to modern humans, but to something in between, something unknown, a forgotten branch of the human tree. They called them the Denisovans. For a long time, they were only ghosts in our genome, known not by faces or artifacts but by the code hidden inside us. The Denisovans were wanderers of impossible worlds. They lived where most could not, high in the mountains, deep in the caves, far from the warmth of the plains. Their lungs drew breath in the thin air of the Himalayas. Their bodies adapted to cold and altitude that would have crushed others. They left behind no great monuments, no carvings or cities, only fragments of themselves woven into the living. For while they seemed to disappear from the map, their blood did not. It traveled, quietly, invisibly, across generations. In the highlands of Papua New Guinea, in the faces of those who walk the mist-covered trails, the Denisovans live on. In the DNA of the peoples of Melanesia, Tibet, and parts of Southeast Asia, pieces of their genome remain proof that the ancient world never truly ended. The ability of modern Tibetans to survive at high altitudes, to breathe easily where oxygen is scarce, comes from them. A gift passed through thousands of years, from a people whose name was forgotten before language learned to remember it. When the Ice Age ended, the Denisovans seemed to fade like snow under sunlight. Their caves emptied, their fires went dark. Yet nature had already preserved them in the most enduring archive of all our own bodies. Every heartbeat carries a trace of their endurance, every breath a piece of their mountain air. Scientists once imagined history as a straight line, one human species replacing another. But the Denisovans proved it was never so simple. The truth is braided. We did not conquer the world alone. We inherited it together. They were not strangers to us, but kin who walked different paths, whose voices have merged with ours in the silence of time. In the deepest parts of our DNA they still whisper. The blood remembers what the mind forgets. The lost tribe was never lost at all, they simply changed form, finding immortality not in fossils or ruins, but in us. And when the wind moves through the mountains of Papua or sighs through the caves of Siberia, it carries a sound that might just be their song, the quiet hum of the forgotten, reminding us that no human story ever truly ends. The story of humanity was once written in the dirt, in bones, in stones, in the black dust of ancient fires. Archaeologists would kneel in the soil, brushing centuries from the surface of skulls, reading history one fracture at a time. But now, the story is written in light and code. The old tools have been replaced by machines that hum quietly in sterile rooms. Inside them, fragments of the ancient world are reborn as data. The bones that once lay frozen in ice or buried in caves now speak in the language of algorithms, and for the first time, we can hear them clearly. It began with a fragment, a tooth, a piece of finger bone, the smallest trace of a person who had lived 40,000 years ago in the depths of Siberia. From it, scientists extracted strands of DNA so fragile they had nearly vanished. Yet inside those molecules lay entire worlds' maps of ancestry, migration, and love. When they decoded it, the pattern that emerged was not the story of one individual, but of many. Lovers who crossed mountains, wanderers who chased the warmth of the Sunday, children who carried the blood of both the known and the forgotten. Each genome became a star chart of our species, points of light connected across continents and millennia. The Neanderthal in a European cave shared fragments with a woman born in modern Spain. The Denisovan child's genes lived quietly in the breath of a Tibetan shepherd. The people of Oceania carried echoes of migrations that had begun when the ice still ruled the seas. What had once been myth, the merging of worlds, the invisible marriages of humanity, was now written in the very cells of our bodies. In laboratories, the algorithms began to see patterns that no human eye could. They traced the ancient roads of migration, from Africa's deserts to the icy edges of Eurasia. From the Himalayas to the Pacific, they revealed that our ancestors had met, loved, and mingled far more often than anyone had imagined. Every person alive today carries the fingerprints of countless others, species once thought extinct, now living on in our blood. Through the bone and the algorithm, we discovered that humanity was never simple. It was a mosaic, a woven tapestry of endless encounters. We are not descendants of one tribe, but of many. The hunter in the tundra, the woman who sang to the stars, the child who watched the last mammoth fall, they are all within us. Each left a trace, a whisper, a code that never faded. The more we learn, the smaller the distance between past and present becomes. The cave and the laboratory are two sides of the same mirror. One lit by firelight, the other by the glow of computer screens. Both searching for meaning, both asking the same question whispered across time. Who were we, and what did we become? The bones have stopped speaking through dust, but their voices remain. Every strand of DNA is a story that never truly ends, an unbroken thread from the frozen world to the one we know now. And as the machines hum and the data unfolds, humanity finds itself staring not into the darkness of the unknown, but into its own reflection, realizing that the answers we sought were always there, waiting in the marrow of our being, carried forward since the Ice Age's final breath. The wind moves gently across the tundra, whispering through the frostbitten grass. Where once there were herds that shook the earth with every step, now there is only silence. The great mammoths, the giants of the ice, are gone. Their shadows linger on the edge of memory, like ghosts imprinted in the snow. On a lonely island in the Arctic Sea, far from the mainland and untouched by the wars or empires of men, the last of them lived, Wrangel Island. A place where time stretched thin, where the Ice Age lingered long after the rest of the world had begun to thaw. For thousands of years after the glaciers retreated, a small herd survived there, cut off from the changing earth. They drank from icy rivers and foraged the brittle grass, their tusks curved like crescents of the moon. The world beyond their island had grown warmer, greener, noisier. But here, the cold still ruled, and they endured. Their calves learned to walk on frost and listen to the same winds their ancestors had heard. They were the last breath of a world that had once belonged to them. The humans who might have seen them never returned with stories. There were no hunters left that far north, no eyes to witness their final days. The mammoths lived and died in solitude, their bones sinking into the frozen soil as if the earth itself wanted to keep them hidden. When the last one fell, perhaps a lone female, old and weary, her ribs sharp beneath her fur, no one marked the moment. There was no sound except the wind, no elegy but the whisper of snow. Yet, in that quiet death, something immense ended. A lineage that had walked the world for millions of years finally vanished. For the first time in history, humanity stood alone. The giants were gone, the saber-toothed cats, the woolly rhinoceroses, the towering ground sloths, all had faded into myth. The Ice Age, with all its beasts and wonders, closed like a book written in bones. The world that followed would be smaller, more familiar, yet emptier. Humans had outlasted everything that once dwarfed them. The balance of life had shifted, and we became the inheritors of a quiet earth. Still, traces of the mammoth lingered. Their ivory tusks, buried in permafrost, would one day be found by curious hands. Their stories would be told in paintings and carvings, in legends whispered beside new fires. Some would call them monsters, others gods. Scientists, thousands of years later, would study their frozen remains, their flesh still intact beneath the ice. They would read their DNA and dream of bringing them back, of undoing extinction itself. But even if their bodies returned, their world would not. The winds of Wrangel Island no longer carry the songs of mammoths, only echoes. Their passing marked more than the end of a species, it marked the beginning of human dominion. Without realizing it, we had inherited the earth. No longer hunters in a world of giants, we had become the giants ourselves. The tundra fell silent, not only because the mammoths were gone, but because there was nothing left to challenge us. And yet, somewhere deep in our memory, their footsteps remain. The sound of heavy breath in the cold, the tremor of the ground beneath vast herds moving like rivers of fur. We still remember them, not in words but in longing. They remind us of a time when the world was shared, when power belonged to more than just one species. On Wrangel Island, the snow still falls as it did 10,000 years ago. Beneath it, the bones of the last mammoth sleep, perfectly preserved, waiting in silence. The world has moved on, but their story endures. It lives in us, the fragile heirs of an age that ended with their final breath. When the ice finally loosened its grip and the last mammoth's shadow disappeared into history, what endured was not bone or fur or tusk, it was us. The people who walked out of that frozen world carried more than tools and fire. They carried memory in their blood, instincts written into their bones, echoes of every ancestor who had ever faced the dark and chosen to live. We are the survivors' legacy, shaped by their hunger, their fear, and their defiance. The Ice Age did not vanish cleanly. It melted into us, leaving behind traces too small to see yet impossible to erase. The curve of a hand gripping a tool, the way we gather around firelight, the fear of cold that lingers, even under electric suns. These are not accidents. They are inheritances, gifts carved through suffering. Our bodies remember even when our minds forget. The pulse that quickens at thunder, the calm that comes from watching flames dance, the instinct to seek warmth and company, all of it comes from them. Their stories never truly ended. They changed shape, passed from word to word, generation to generation. The myths of fire gods, of storms that cleansed the earth, of heroes who stole warmth from the heavens, each one carries the fingerprints of those who once crouched beneath stone ceilings, whispering tales to the rhythm of crackling fire. We are still telling their stories, only the language has changed. Even now, in the modern world of steel and light, the past hums quietly beneath our skin. Our genes still hold the marks of the Neanderthals and Denisovans, fragments of forgotten love and ancient survival. They taught us endurance, strength, and the art of adaptation. Through them, we learned to face scarcity, to make tools from nothing, to turn fear into strategy. Their blood runs through us as proof that no extinction could stop the will to live. But their greatest legacy is not in muscle or memory, it is in imagination. Somewhere in those frozen centuries, humanity learned to dream. They painted stories on cave walls not because they needed to, but because they wanted to leave something behind. That desire to be remembered, to connect, to make meaning out of the void is what carried us beyond the Ice Age. It is what carried us here. When we look at the stars, when we build cities, when we tell stories by the light of a screen instead of a fire, we are continuing what they began. We are still the same fragile beings, born into a world that does not promise mercy, yet endlessly inventing ways to survive it. We are the proof that their struggle was not in vain. Every heartbeat is an echo of their courage. Every breath is a continuation of their defiance. They lived, they adapted, they endured, and in doing so, they became us. The survivor's legacy is not buried in the ice. It walks the earth, speaks, loves, and remembers. It is humanity itself, still carrying the flame they refused to let die. The storm had ended, but the world it left behind was not the same. The ice had pulled back, the floods had retreated, and the winds had softened. But what remained was a strange and quiet earth. The great herds were gone, their bones scattered beneath the soil. The sky hung wide and empty, and the people who had endured the cold now stood in a landscape that felt unfamiliar, almost hollow. It was a silence deeper than anything they had ever known, a silence that came after survival. They built their fires on the same hills where mammoths once roamed. Smoke curled into the still air, rising like the last prayers of the Ice Age. Children played where glaciers had melted, their laughter echoing through valleys that had never heard such sounds before. For the first time in generations, There was no constant hunger, no need to keep moving, yet with the calm came unease. The people had been shaped by struggle. They knew how to fight the cold, not how to live without it. The world was waking, but slowly. The rivers began to sing again, threading through the softening earth. Trees pushed through the thawing ground, their roots splitting the ice from below. Birds returned to the skies, filling the air with the music of something ancient rediscovered. And still, the people gathered around their fires, whispering the stories of the world that had come before the beasts. The darkness, the endless winters. Each tale was half memory, half dream, retold until the line between truth and legend blurred completely. The elders spoke of the ones who came before the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, the forgotten tribes whose blood still lingered in their veins. They said those ancestors had not vanished but had become spirits of the mountains, the rivers, and the wind. The fire crackled as they spoke, casting shifting shadows that danced like the ghosts of those old kin. The people did not see extinction, they saw transformation. Memory had become sacred, a bridge between what had been and what was coming. Time began to stretch differently now. Seasons could be counted. Settlements lasted longer. Seeds were gathered and guarded. Fire was tended instead of stolen. The restless wandering of the Ice Age was giving way to something slower, something rooted. Yet even as the first embers of civilization began to flicker, the silence of the old world remained within them, a quiet hum beneath every heartbeat, a reminder that they had once stood at the edge of extinction and survived. They would not write their history in stone or clay for many ages still. For now, their records were carried in breath, in story, in the rhythm of the spoken word. The forgotten human, the one who had braved the storms and walked with giants, began to fade from sight but not from memory. Their spirit lived on in myth, in the tales that would one day become gods and heroes. The wind moved through the grasslands, soft and steady, carrying those whispers into the future. The age of ice had ended, but its silence lingered, a silence not of death, but of transformation. The world had survived its storm, and from that quiet would rise something entirely new. Night falls softly across the warming earth. The glaciers are gone now, their ghosts reflected in the quiet shimmer of distant seas. The air carries the scent of wet soil and green things growing, a fragrance the world has not known in thousands of years. Where once there was only ice, there are rivers now, winding like silver threads through the plains. The fires we build no longer fight against extinction, they are built for comfort, for gathering, for memory. Humanity has survived the storm, but the story is not over. It never was. The people sit beneath the open sky, looking up at constellations that have guided them for countless generations. They see the same stars their ancestors saw when the world was frozen. The difference now is warmth. The air, the earth, even their hearts carry a gentler rhythm. But deep inside that calm, something ancient still stirs the pulse of those who came before. The hunters who chased mammoths across white horizons, the women who carved flutes from bird bones, the children who pressed painted hands against cave walls. Their lives are still here, echoing through us in ways we do not always understand. Every breath we take is a continuation of theirs. Every instinct that drives us to build, to love, to fear the dark, to gather around the glow of firelight comes from them. Their resilience did not end when the ice melted. It became our inheritance. They taught the world what endurance means. And though their names are lost, their memory lives in the spark of every human gesture, in the quiet courage that keeps us moving forward. The story of survival has no final page. It flows through time the way rivers carve through stone, shaping everything that follows. From the ashes of the cold world rose cities, language, and the endless pursuit of meaning. But even surrounded by light and invention, we remain their children, carriers of ancient fear and ancient wonder. Somewhere in our dreams, the wind of the Ice Age still whispers across the plains. As we lie beside our modern fires, the crackle of flame sounds the same as it did 40,000 years ago. It is the heartbeat of continuity, the voice of those who refuse to vanish. The forgotten human breathes within us, unseen but alive, in the curve of our hands, in the rhythm of our hearts, in the stories we keep telling. We are their afterthought, their success, their proof. The earth is warm again, but the memory of cold still shapes our souls. That memory is not a burden. It is a promise. The fire will never go out, not as long as someone tends it, not as long as someone remembers. The dream of continuance is not about survival alone. It is about legacy, the quiet understanding that life endures through connection, through story, through the breath that moves from one age to the next. The forgotten humans are gone, but they are also eternal. Their story did not end in the ice. It continues every time we speak, every time we create, every time we look into the flames and see, for a fleeting moment, the reflection of those who came before us. The world turns, the night deepens, and still the fire burns. Their story, our story, goes on.